Well, good morning, everyone. We are studying in the book of 2 Corinthians. We started 1 Corinthians a little over a year ago, and I appreciate you slogging along with me. Of course, we've spent most of the time in 1 Corinthians because there were a number of issues that Paul identified that the congregation had. And then, as we go into 2 Corinthians, the nature of the letter is much different. And, for the regulars in the class, I apologize, you've heard this before, but, just to make sure that, we are all on the same page, as you look at this letter, it's not as carefully laid out as the 1 Corinthian letter. And the nature of the letter is explained by the events that were occurring. We believe that Paul was over in Ephesus when he wrote the 1 Corinthian letter. And, after, he was in Ephesus for a while, he went to Antioch and then went back to Ephesus. And it's not clear whether, when we say he wrote the 1 Corinthian letter from Ephesus, whether that was on, the second or third missionary trip. But apparently Paul was expecting some response from Titus as to how the congregation received that letter. And so he had planned to go up into, what we think of as Turkey now. And it seemed to, because of the problems with the silversmiths and other issues in Ephesus, may have left Ephesus a little early. But he was planning on meeting Titus at Troas. But Titus didn't come. And as you read through the 2 Corinthian letter, you see him referring several times to his anxiety over what is happening in the congregation. So he leaves Troas, he goes on up into Macedonia. Try to get the right button here. And he goes to Philippi, and rather between Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, I don't know where. That's when Titus finally catches up with him. Titus, relates all of the things that happened in Corinth after they received his letter, and provides really a good report for that. And it seems that Paul wrote this 2 Corinthian letter, or what we call the 2 Corinthian letter, pretty hurriedly, sending it back with Titus, because you think about it, he's going to Corinth. That's the plan. But he wants to get a letter there sooner. And so that's the letter that we're currently you're looking at. So let me see if I can't get rid of this map. And we'll look at our outline. And as we looked before on the outline, we see that most of the letter is Paul defending himself. And there's this incongruity in the letter between him praising the Corinthians, but yet at the same time having to defend himself in his ministry. Now, we do have a section, we spent some time, about the gifts that were being collected for the saints in Judea. And in fact, what we have in our Bibles, 2 chapters, is devoted to that. He'd already written to them in the 1 Corinthian letter about, I want you every time you meet on Sunday, to put aside, put it together in a common treasury so that when I and the other representatives of the other congregations get there, you won't have to be scurrying around. It'll be ready. So he continues, he writes about the importance of generosity and, about particularly the Corinthians' generosity, because it was their idea to begin with that this contribution be taken and sent to Judea. And he's praising them for that. But then we go down into chapter 10. And let's start by reading that, where he's again spending a good part of this letter defending himself. Now I, Paul, myself, entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I, who in your presence am lowly among you, but being absent and of good courage toward you. Yea, I beseech you, that I may not, when present, show courage, when the confidence wherein I count to be bold, against some, whom count others as if we walked according to the flesh. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not fleshly, but are mighty before God in casting down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that is exalted against the knowledge of God, and bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ, and being in readiness to avenge all disobedience when your obedience shall be made full. You look at the things that are before your face. If any man trusted in himself that he is Christ, let him consider this again with himself, that even as he is in Christ, so also are we. For though I should glory somewhat abundantly concerning our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up, and not for casting you down, I shall not be put to shame, that I may not be seen as if I would terrify you by my letters. For his letters, they say, are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is of no account. Let such a one reckon this, that we are in the word by letters, when we are absent, such as we are indeed when we are present. For we are not bold to number or compare ourselves with certain of them that commend themselves, but they themselves, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves by themselves, are without understanding. For we will not glory beyond our measure, but according to the measure of the province which God has apportioned us as a measure, to reach even unto you. For we stretch not ourselves overmuch, as though, as though we reach not unto you, for we even came as far as unto you in the gospel of Christ, not glorying beyond our measure, that is, in the other men's labors, but having hope that as your faith groweth, we shall be magnified in you according to our province, unto further abundance, so as to preach the gospel even unto the parts beyond you, and not to glory in another man's province in regard to things ready to our hand. But he that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. For not he that commendeth himself is approved, but he whom the Lord commendeth. American Standard Version is a little more difficult to read through, so I apologize for that. Switch computers, so I don't have the New American right now, to put in for this. So for the rest of this, we'll be looking at it from the English Standard Version as we look at it. So the wording is going to vary here. So Paul writes of himself as being meek in person and bold, when he's away. Does that seem like a strange thing for you to write to somebody? And normally we think of maybe it being a little opposite, but why would Paul write this?
The accusations that are being made.
So even though he's been praising the Corinthians in this letter, all's not perfect in Corinth, is it? There are some people who are challenging Paul. And we see different hints in the 1st and 2nd Corinthian letter. Some of the things, as we talked about in the 1st Corinthian letter, kind of related to people who are known as Sophist. People who went from town to town, extolling their knowledge and wisdom, and essentially, big name speakers. And it's sort of seemed like maybe some people were comparing Paul to them, and of course Paul not appearing and not using the same stylized forms of speech, etc., might appear to come off second. As we get into the next chapter from this, we're going to see that many of the people who are criticizing him and are trying to replace him are Hebrews. And I think by context are teaching the Jewish law to these Christians in Corinth. So whichever group, maybe a little bit of both. There are people there who didn't think of Paul as being particularly impressive when he visited. But boy, he sure wrote some stinging criticism in that 1 Corinthian letter, didn't he? So here you find Paul himself drawing attention to that. And this chapter is essentially working around that theme of, yeah, you might think me as being bold in my letters, but guess what? Things might turn out a little differently. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, a passage that I think relates to this. And when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. And my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. So Paul seems to have deliberately adjusted his speaking style and how he conducted himself in the Corinthian congregation so that they would not put him in the other category. Yes?
I've always found this passage of 2 Corinthians an interesting contrast to the experience that he had in Lystra, where they had healed someone and there was a lot of excitement.
Oh, yeah.
This, and they called Barnabas and Paul Jupiter and Mercury.
Yes.
Because Paul was the chief speaker. So that makes it sound like he was, if he's speaking like a god, you would think that probably they thought well of what he was speaking, how he was speaking. And here he seems to denigrate his own public message.
And considering all the time he had spent studying the Jewish law, particularly under one of the well-known lawyers of the period, Gamaliel, you would think that he would have the capability to strongly and forcefully proclaim the gospel. And I come away from that with the conclusion that Paul deliberately chose not to emulate that style. That we've seen in both 1st and 2nd Corinthian letter, he's not taking any contributions from those saints. Why? Bill?
I think we may have discussed this in the past. There was the fact that the Sophists, they came there, with their lectures about this, that, and the other, and made people think they were knowledgeable and intelligent and everything. They did it for money. They did it for to be rewarded financially, whereas Paul did not want, I think, anyway, the people of Corinth, the Christians there, to think that he was there for the same reason. And I thought about this fact that he was somewhat reserved, is the word I'll use, in his presence with the church, that he didn't even want them to think that he was doing everything he was doing to really be bold. The gospel can be preached strongly, but it can also be preached very conservatively too.
Let me utilize an illustration. I'm not sure that they're that popular now, but I can remember, 20, 30 years ago was really the era of the televangelist, right?
Oh, yeah.
And what was the common theme that you heard from the televangelist?
Money.
Yeah, send me money. We've got all of these works, and we want you to send money. Well, is it wrong for a gospel preacher to encourage Christians to give? No. Do you want to utilize and appear to be the same as those who are not operating from the correct motives? No. And so a preacher might, in fact, tune his lessons about giving to be quite a bit different than how a televangelist would present that. And, as Bill mentioned, a group that we call, or we know of as the Sophist, they were the big name people. They were the big name speakers of the time. And they made the good ones, good, quote unquote, made a tremendously profitable living off going and speaking in these various cities. And everyone, welcomed their wisdom and paid them accordingly. But Paul, again, as he's going to point out in a little bit, he's taken money from other congregations so he doesn't have to take anything from them. Not that the Corinthians were poor. He wants to go out of his way, it seems, to avoid sharing the appearance of those who are proclaiming wisdom, again, from the Greek standpoint, for money. So he's tailored the way he presents things to focus the emphasis on the gospel, not on him as a speaker. But that's had a consequence too. And that people who were well, if you were really somebody, you would be like that guy over there that's making millions, speaking tours. No. But they haven't jumped past that. And, an additional piece of information for you. You think about the first chapter of 1 Corinthians. He describes what Jews and Gentiles are looking for. Greek searches for wisdom. Jews search for signs. Does the gospel fit in to those, ways of viewing the world? No, it does not. And so Paul, I think, I share with you, even though it's been a few years since he's been at Lystra, he has the capability of speaking in a way that I think would be impressive to others. But he did not come to Corinth that way. And maybe because of his experience in Lystra. And maybe because of his experience in Athens. He's chosen to come different, present it in a different way. Any other thoughts on this before we move on?
Back in 1 Corinthians 9, where he becomes all things to all men,
Yes.
he makes the statement that expresses what I think you're saying. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, that I may be a fellow partaker of it. And I have heard about the matter at Lystra, where Paul was speaking, and from their philosophical perspective, the lesser of the two is the spokesman. And so they are impressed because of position and the miracles that are there. And again, what Paul is doing here is just wanting to see the gospel go forward. And in Philippians chapter 1, I've just been recently thinking about that, where people are preaching the correct gospel, but they're doing it in such a way that it's out of envy and jealousy.
Yes.
But what you see unfold in Philippians is that it is in the spotlight that it's not about Paul, it is about the gospel, and that he came as a servant. In chapter 2, Christ came as a servant, and he's trying to get them to have that same mindset because of some problems that are there. I think that's what you see here. It's not about me. What is good in regard to the gospel? I'm not taking wages because it's good for the gospel, for you and those things. And so the very foundation of all that he does is not about him. And that's such a hard thing for us to get straight in our heads as human beings and for personally.
And we also need to remember, we might tailor our behavior and the way we speak to help the most people, But that doesn't mean that there aren't some people who are going to take that and run with it in the wrong direction regardless of what we do. And that seems to have been one of the problems here.
And it's always the same gospel. You just arise to the need.
Yeah. And now, here he's not only, recognizing that, they have this comparison of, him being present, he's weak, and in another passage, the phrase contemptible is used. And he's bold when he writes in his letters. But now he's begging them to behave themselves in such a way that he's not going to have to be bold when he gets there. Could Paul be bold in his presentation? Yeah. I mean, individuals, particularly on his first missionary trip, he had an individual struck down, because of this. And he goes on to point out that we do not wage war according to the flesh. Okay, we know that. We I think, understand that principle ourselves. But how does that relate to his arguments here? Why does he bring this up, we're not waging war according to the flesh, when he's defending himself about being bold or gentle or all of those sorts of things? Go ahead, Brent.
Well, I guess in the context of here, it's his physical presence being there in the flesh as opposed to being in absence. He would much prefer them to accept his authority and the changes that they need to make without, on the sake of just that authority, rather than having to then him throw his physical presence in there to maybe push it over the top. Well, if it's just the fact that he finally showed up that finally convinces them to do us right, then how convinced are they? And will they be unconvinced if he's not there in the flesh? He wants to convince their hearts, not, I don't know, whatever impresses them when someone is in right there talking with them, being, being persuasive or.
Again, I would point back to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. For consider your calling, brethren, that there are not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things that are strong. And the base things of the world and the despised God has chosen, the things that are not, that he might nullify the things that are, that no man should boast before God. So, you think about who are the most respected generals. Typically, it's not the quiet guy who sits in the corner of the meeting room. It's a guy who has pretty strong personality that projects. I mean, same with all sorts of leaders. But that's thinking like the world. And Paul isn't conforming to the standards of the world. In Ephesians chapter 6, finally be strong in the Lord and with the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. And how do we fight those battles? How do we defend ourselves in those battles? Paul is using the tools that God has given him to, in fact, spread the gospel so that he and others can fight in those battles. And it's not about being great ego. It's not about being tremendously forceful all the time. It's focused on other things. Yes, Brent.
This isn't directly related related to Paul's point here, but both of these passages of Scripture are connect very deeply with our society and culture, and how evil prevails in our society. In past generations, Satan has always been the father of lies and accomplished much of his work through deception.
Mm-hmm.
But there's an awful lot of evil that got done through force.
Mm-hmm.
Through the, whether just direct force or bringing the compulsion of the government against people to bring something into play or make it happen. But we're living in a generation when not just Satan, but the powers who are seeking evil's advance have mostly figured out that the weapons of lies are more powerful even than the weapons of compulsion. And so many evil forces in our society for the past several generations have not tried to force people to become more evil. They've tried to deceive them into becoming more evil. And they have been highly effective. So Christians are being trained ever since the New Testament that our primary weapons are not physical, but are spiritual. But it seems like in our society over the past several generations, our enemies have also figured out that the more powerful weapons are spiritual weapons, and so they're trying to more directly spiritually degrade society. But we should have been trained for centuries on this type of spiritual warfare and be not deceived as easily as, say, non-Christians in our society.
Well, yeah, I agree with the points you make, but in addition, I would suggest that all throughout history, Satan uses whatever tool for that particular society works the best. It's going to be 20, 30 years after this that we find that the Gnostic movement starts, beginning to take hold, based on the idea of, we have this special knowledge from God and deceitful knowledge. So you see Satan fighting that way, even the end of the first century. At the same time, you have the Roman, and you certainly have earlier, before 70 AD, you have the Jewish authorities using physical force. Whichever technique works the best in the particular society at the particular time, that's what will be used. Fortunately, we don't see the physical force that much in the Western civilization, at least not in the United States. Great Britain, some of the other places, that's changing. But the false teaching, that's always on the table. Sometimes Christians are just, let me use the phrase Christendom, is less resistant, to that particular mode. All right. Anything else?
John,
Yes.
as I look at the passages up there in 2 Corinthians 10, 1 through 6, I get the impression that Paul thinks that if he's bold among them, that they may think that he's more fleshly oriented instead of spiritually oriented. It's because he says, may not have to show boldness with such confidence as I count on showing against someone who suspects us of walking according to the flesh. And then he says, for though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. And I don't see Paul talking about his being somewhat meek amongst other churches. If he has, it doesn't come to mind.
Well, and it is important as he's talking about, we're not waging war according to the flesh. how we wage this spiritual war is entirely different and has much different characteristics than you'd wage a physical war. And what he's doing is how to wage that spiritual war. But, the key as we go down here, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. If you will, this is in part an information war. Let's get the right information out there. And take every thought captive to obey Christ. And, notice here, a key for them to figure out is being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. I didn't ask the question, but what does he mean here? Why is he waiting to punish every disobedience when the obedience is complete?
Keep reading 2 Corinthians. Gives the answer.
All right. Look at what is before your eyes. If anyone's confident that he is Christ, let him remind himself that just as he is Christ, so also are we. For even if I boast a little too much of our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up, and not for destroying you, I will not be ashamed. As he's continuing here, he's reminding them that what they think themselves of Christ, how should they think of Paul? But I do not want to appear to be frightening you with my letters. Again, for my letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech is of no account. Let such a person understand that what we say by letter when absent, we do when present. Not that we dare to classify or compare ourselves with some of those who are commending themselves. But when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they are without understanding. And again, he's already written this to them in 1 Corinthians. In chapter 4, I urge you then to be imitators of me. That's why I sent you Timothy, my beloved faithful child in the Lord, to remind you of my ways in Christ, as I teach them in every church. Some are arrogant, as though I were not coming to you. But I will come to you soon, and if the Lord wills, I will find out not the talk of these arrogant people, but their power. For the kingdom of God does not consist in talk, but in power. What do you wish? Should I come to you with a rod, or with the love of the spirit of gentleness? Is there any wonder that they might be saying, oh, well, he's writing these letters. He can be kind of strong, right? And forceful. That's pretty strong and forceful, isn't it? Well, now the time is coming when he is coming there. And, to get back to the question that I had asked earlier, why was he going to wait to punish those who were disobedient when everyone else was obedient? To create the contrast. To generate, these are the people that are doing it right. You are doing it wrong. And just like the man who had his father's life in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. There's a contrast there that they could see. And as a result, their mechanism to punish that individual was to withdraw their social contact from him. But that only works if you have a majority of people who have the right attitude about sin, right? If everyone was, busy, engaging in whatever activities, sinful activities they wanted to, that method of bringing obedience doesn't work. Now, as we mentioned before, Paul had other tools as an apostle he could probably use to be very forceful about identifying those who were not following properly. But I don't think that's what he wants to do. So, any other thoughts here? Well, I ask one question that you might want to think about. Do Christians today fall into this trap on how they evaluate evangelists? Or have we managed to work our way completely out of this weakness? Yes, Bill?
Talking about having favorite preachers?
Well, one can have a favorite preacher and not necessarily be guilty of the things that we're seeing here. But sometimes we do build a stereotype of who's the really good evangelist. They're entertaining. They're easy to listen to. And, they have, a great, physical presence. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't object to any of those things, particularly being easy to listen to. But is that really what is important?
The message itself is what's important. And different men have different means of preaching the lesson they prepared, how they do it. And the problem is if we got this mindset of, well, I've got a favorite preacher, I really, really like him, then we don't do it justice here when someone preaches has a different style, and we're not really paying close attention because we're not being entertained maybe, or it's just, it's a fine line, I think, sometimes in this.
It's like a container with a beverage inside. What's important, the container or the beverage? I mean, if you buy a can of Coca-Cola and the label's mostly torn off and it's an ugly container, or they did one of their rebrands that they do occasionally, and you don't like the can or you don't like the bottle, did that change what's inside? The bigger problem is if they change what's inside. And isn't that really the case here? Individual evangelists look different. They have different strengths and weaknesses. But if they have the message inside that is correct, that's what's important. But the Corinthians, at least a few in Corinth, weren't really past that. And then he talks about those who measure yourself by yourself, or, measure yourself by, the others in your group. What's the danger in that?
The true measure is Jesus Christ. If we're measuring by any other standard,
Mm-hmm.
we will fall short.
Yeah, if I compare myself to my other buddies that I go out and do whatever I might go out and do with them, is that a good standard? Will I ever be better than the other buddies?
Or you can word it a different way. I do more than he does, so I think I'm doing pretty good.
Okay. Yeah. That's the other way it shows up. James wrote about it in James chapter 1. But be doers of the word, and not merely hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. But he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he's like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. If anyone thinks he's religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives himself, his heart, this person's religious religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit the orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. So, James identifies two things here that are important. He first starts with those who are doers versus hearers, which, ought to be an easy, thing to consider. Are you all words? Are you really practicing? But then, he brings it to the idea of looking in a mirror. Who are you? What are you? If you look at a mirror, which is described here, as, the word, the perfect law of liberty. If you're looking at that and comparing yourself, that's the standard. And that will lead you to say, yes, I need to change. My hair is parted in the wrong direction. I need to repart it. Whatever it might be, from looking in that mirror, that's how we're supposed to look at the Word of God. It's not an idle, curiosity. It's not, okay, well, I will memorize all these passages or whatever. It's how we use it to change our lives. And finally, we will not boast beyond limits, but we will boast only in regard to the area of influence God has assigned us to reach, even to you. Paul, again, defends his boasting here, and that's going to be sort of the theme of these three chapters. We do not boast beyond limit in the labors of others, but our hope is that as your faith increases, our area of influence may be greatly enlarged. So Paul is defending his ability to say, we're doing this for God. You are our field. We planted the congregation there. We have a right to talk to you. Now, with that said, do Christians, or should Christians, boast about their work in Christ?
Yes,
Okay.
if it's done right.
That answer is almost always true. Okay, how should it be done right? And how can it be done wrong?
Matthew 5:16, let your light shine so it glorifies God, not yourself.
Okay, certainly an example. You're showing, and what you say.
And your motive.
Yeah. So, how do we resolve the idea of boasting and humility?
Boast in Him.
Which pretty much Paul is doing here, right? Now, I would also caution that we may not have the platform to boast that Paul has. Humility might come into that a little bit too. So certainly his position and what he's doing and his prominence generates a standard for which he can approach them. But that doesn't mean it's wrong for us to stand up and say, yes, I did such and such and such and such, if you're not trying to do it to glorify yourself. If you're truly looking to use that as a way to help others to overcome. And, one of the examples may be, I had this particular trial, and here's how I managed to overcome it with God's help. And talking to someone else that's facing a similar trial. I mean, you can probably think of a bunch of different ways in which...
In regard to what you're saying, that's really a powerful thing about our influence in the world. And the there's this passage about Legion, when they're cast out, what's following. He says, you go tell everybody what God has done for you. And that's really at the heart of what Paul does here and what we need to do. And so it's not just among other Christians. It's about our life.
Yeah.
And so that principle is the foundation to all those relationships.
And among evangelical churches, you have the practice of giving testimony. And a lot of times, the focus of that testimony really isn't correct according to how the gospel is spread and how a person becomes converted. But a lot of times it is when they're talking about, yes, I face this problem, and I turn to the Bible, and I turn to God, and He helped me overcome it. That's an appropriate testimony for us as Christians, isn't it? All right, my time is gone. Thank you so much. We'll mention that Brent will be teaching next week while I'm in Texas again. And so I presume that you will be continuing into the next chapter. Handouts are available on the back. Thank you.
Good job, John. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.